This is Jeffrey Tucker of Brownstone Institute, and I would like to welcome you to a very special edition of the Brownstone Show. Today I'll be interviewing Jan Jekielek on his new book. Jan is the senior editor at the Epoch Times and the host of the very famous show American Thought Leaders. Before I introduce him, though, I just want to raise a larger topic, and it concerns something that seems rather philosophical, maybe abstract, the kind of thing you talk about in ethics class as an undergraduate and then forget about it later, but actually could be the most important topic of our times. And it concerns the relationship between freedom and this notion of individual human dignity, the inherent dignity of the person. It seems abstract. Oh, does this belong in Sunday school class? Actually, it may be the central debate of our times. In the late 19th century, there was a new concept floating around. It has origins much earlier, but called utilitarianism, which is that we're just seeking the best possible outcome for the biggest possible number. And the carnage along the way shouldn't really matter, that we're going to think of society as a homogeneous blob and maybe like an omelet, and that if you have to break some eggs along the way, that's what you have to do to get to the best possible outcomes. It's a utilitarian philosophy, and it applies to so many areas of life today, and it fundamentally undermines this idea of the inherent dignity of every individual person, this notion that the human person is unique and not just used for instrumental value, that there are rights that are attached to us by virtue of our status as having been created by God, with certain reasoning powers and rights that are exceptional to the human person. Why does this matter so much? Well, it seems like more and more the world is populated by regimes and social systems and governmental systems that essentially deny that this is true. Maybe not explicitly, but it's more and more so we see it in the operations of power in the world. One of the worst practitioners of this philosophy is, of course, the CCP in China. And we've known this for many years. Communism is gone in name only. Actually, the name is still there. The Chinese Communist Party still maintains the name. It's a communism with Chinese characteristics, right? But we've known for really decades about the problem of the possibility of organ harvesting taking place in China, a vibrant marketplace that relies essentially on coercion to serve not only population needs, but those around the world. The strange thing about this topic is that there has not really been a book about it, no systematic analysis of it, and no real public attention to it other than whispers in the background. Jan Jekielek has spent a career focused on this for reasons we'll talk about in this interview. And he has this new book out, which is a thrilling read. It's called, and I have it here, it's called Killed to Order. And it's become quite a bestseller, I'm thrilled to say. And it's a wonderful read. And the important thing about the book is it helps us think through these fundamental philosophical topics. It takes the urgency of this seeming abstract notion. What is the dignity of the individual? What is it worth? What is the basis of human rights? What is the basis of freedom? And makes it exceptionally real in ways that you rarely see. Jan is also the host of American Thought Leaders, which in very difficult times over the last 5 and 6 years has been such a sanctuary of high-level thought. I was raised, when I was young, on William F. Buckley's firing line, which is engaging, sometimes fiery, but always highly intellectual discussions between William F. Buckley and whoever he had on as a guest. I was such a fanatic for the show that I would order the transcripts, and they were sent to me by mail, and I would review them and underline them and highlight them. Of course, we live in a different age with the internet, but oddly, that high quality content is not available in the same way it was even when I was young, except for American Thought Leaders with Jan Jekielek, who has a show, maybe it's several times a week, but it's I think the most intellectually powerful show on the internet, and is sponsored by Epoch Times. So I'd like to welcome Jan Jekielek, author of Kill to Order, to Brownstone Show. Welcome, Jan.
Jeffrey, thank you so much for the really generous introduction. I have to say, as you're talking about this kind of assault on the dignity of the individual human being and the connection to freedom, writing this book, it really became stark for me. Of course, a central theme to the book is this sort of deviation from Hippocratic medicine towards this utilitarian bioethical view of the world, the greatest good for the greatest number. And, of course, we thought a lot about this during COVID, right? Because it was all for the greater good, right? And the problem is with the greater good is that someone gets to decide what that is, right? And, I was honestly moved. Like, it was hard for me. I think I even started tearing a little bit as you were describing this, because it is the fundamental battle of our time, what you're describing. And I didn't fully grasp, when as I wrote this book, it was very emotional somehow, but I do feel the book encapsulates this battle actually in a very profound way. And when I think about it, but I just didn't think of it that way until you just mentioned it. So perhaps I just realized my book is a little more profound than I even thought.
No, I think that's right. And well, the other thing that makes me realize something. I think back in my days taking ethics classes and philosophy classes and reflecting on matters of religion and ethics and these kinds of things. And it always seemed to be a bit of a parlor game. We're debating this, debating that. And yeah, it was important to reflect on things, read things, but intellectual life for a good part of my life seemed to be a kind of enjoyable game that we played, just thinking about these things. I don't know what's happened, but our most recent times have made the parlor games exceptionally real. These old debates we used to have, the old dusty books that we used to read are suddenly all the ideas embedded in them are everywhere around us. So I'd like to dig into that a little bit, because while your book is about the organ harvesting in China, a very detailed construction about what we know, what we don't know, and what we should know more about. You spoke at the Kennedy Center the other night with our nice friend, you're the gentleman who interviewed you.
Yeah, Rob Schneider.
Rob Schneider.
And I like the joke here too, right? Who's that? Who's that strange guy?
No, it's
right?
I'd like to slip my mind. Yeah, but sorry, my apologies. But Rob Schneider, and I was really grateful that I came for that event, because I kept seeing all these parallels between what you were talking about and how many elites in Western societies in the U.S. See the human person, and this term you kept throwing out called instrumentalization, that we're just an assembly of body parts to be used, to be manipulated, to be pillaged and taken, and to serve the purposes of a plan. Yes, your book highlights this in the practices of the CCP regarding organ harvesting, but you can see the ideas strangely all around us in other areas. And why don't we back up just a little bit and You went through this the other night at your interview with Rob Schneider, but I wonder if you could just kind of review for us how this topic became so important to you and why it is that you ended up being the author of this book.
I will. Let me touch on one thing that you just mentioned, right? Because you did mention in your opening, you said, if you it's kind of like having an omelet, but it's okay to break a few eggs. Now, some of the viewers here will recognize that this is an allusion to Joseph Stalin's famous statement, right? In order to make an omelet, you have to break a few eggs. I've known this for decades, although there's some debate. Maybe it was Walter Duranty that actually said this, but as I was writing this book, it crystallized in my mind, right? Because I was thinking, it made me think about this utilitarian bioethical model. And I realized, my God, the kind of apotheosis of this, the quintessential expression of utilitarian bioethics is Joseph Stalin's famous statement, okay? And it's because in communism, the greatest good is the survival and supremacy of the Communist Party. Right? They just decide that. And that's why you get a trust. That's why the Chinese Communist Party is the greatest killer in the history of the world. Right? And every communist society has these mass atrocities because when push comes to shove, right? You just expend the people. Who cares? Right? It's this extreme utilitarianism and instrumentalization of human beings, right? And everything else as well, right? But human beings just become a tool for power, really. And this is the crazy part. This is inherent. We hear about this is like it wasn't real communism that time. Like you hear about this so many times. Right? But no, this is precisely communism. This is how it works. This is it's a feature, as they say, not a bug. Okay. And all of this really came out as I was writing. But okay, so let me now answer your question. I just had to get that off my chest.
Yeah,
okay?
And let me just because everything you say makes me want to say a comment. So we had this abstract philosophical idea called utilitarianism with bearded professors, in the front of the room talking about it. But in reality, what it actually means is the sustenance, survival, and thriving of the regime itself, right? So that the greatest good is whatever is good for the party. Anything that hurts the party has to be destroyed. That's what utilitarianism amounts to in practice. Amazing.
Yeah, I mean, and it's not even that complicated, okay? But this is, okay, if I may rant just for a moment, it just drives me insane, this specious veneer, okay, of communism. Like people walking around with their freaking Che Guevara shirts, not understanding what they're saying, right, with this. Like, it has this, the communist societies, the number one thing they're good at is propaganda. This is, our friend Phil Magnus, okay, amazing study looking at Marx, right? Where he decided to look at, Marx apparently died with like 2 people at his funeral. It was unknown. His economic theory had been debunked serially during his life. Like but what this great the mythology is someone, oh my God, he wrote Das Kapital, he wrote the Communist Manifesto, and the world achieved critical consciousness, and suddenly the revolution begins. No, that's not what happened. The Bolsheviks take power, okay? And then Lenin finds a leftist, okay, who he feels, oh, this will make a great myth for us to explain how just taking power by through extreme means to justify it. And he picked that. And suddenly that's when Marx becomes a hero, right? Through Bolshevik propaganda, through communist propaganda, right? It was the other way around. It was just like it was a convenient tool for explaining how you can do what you just did in Russia. Okay, and then then the myth of Marx. My book is right now #1. I keep checking. I wish I didn't do this, but I do. I have to confess. Okay,
don't do that. Don't do that.
It's #1 in communism and socialism, right?
Oh, that's fun.
But up there in the top 10 constantly. It's been #1 like that for a while now. I hope it gets #1 in some bigger categories soon. Okay, but the Communist Manifesto, Marx is up there. Always. People are buying, and I mean, not that we shouldn't understand it. We should. It should be read. Everybody should read this, but understand that this philosophy, this ideology it facilitates mass murder always. It's important, right, to read this in that context, right, and not think, oh, this is great, theoretical bearded guy, like you said. No, practical reality is this philosophy facilitates mass murder every single time and justifies it, right, in the name of the glorious revolution. Okay, rant over.
Speaking
should
of
I
books
answer your question now?
Books on communism. One of my favorite books that had a huge impact on my life is The Black Book of Communism. I don't know if you've heard of it.
Of course.
Yeah,
I'm very familiar. Yes.
Yeah.
It's a bit outdated. Needs to be updated now. Okay. Yeah. Organ harvesting needs to get in there.
Updated. It needs to be on Kindle. It's not on Kindle. You can only order, I'm not even sure if it's in print, but you can only order a physical copy. I'm just like, why is this book not in every library? I mean, it should be available. It should be on your laptop. It's got a full chapter on the history of the Mao, and the Cultural Revolution in China too, as you recall. Okay, let's do the thing. So, how did you get interested in organ harvesting in China? I know your story, but I think you need to tell it for the viewers.
Okay, no, I mean, I don't know what the long version or the short version, but no. So, I was actually, I was an evolutionary biologist back in the day. Okay, I studied lemur genetics. I was looking at hybridization between species of lemur. I worked in Madagascar. I had a lab in the University of Alberta in Edmonton. Okay, in Canada. I'm Canadian, by the way. Kind of watching a little bit in shock what's happening to my country right now, but that's a whole different discussion. Kind of the same discussion actually, but a bit of a different discussion. And I basically, the last time I came back from the field getting genetic samples, I got extremely ill. I ended up with something called Guillain-Barré. People who are Brownstone watchers, GB, would be kind of familiar with this likely. It's an autoimmune disease. It's a syndrome, so multiple different possible causes, but it's basically your immune system goes haywire and attacks your peripheral nervous system, and you lose control of your body. And actually, I was doing a book event last night, and there was a woman in the audience, I was talking about this too, who had Guillain-Barré, and it progresses typically from the legs up, and she basically was paralyzed from the waist down, and she was telling me she was crawling and stuff. I didn't have it quite that bad. For me, just my fine motor skills degraded dramatically to the point where I just walked kind of funny. Well, not kind of funny. It was debilitating. Okay. And I couldn't do my work. It killed my career. That was it. And so, I open-minded. I was, I was a very science-focused person. Okay. That was my kind of tool to understanding reality, if you will. Okay. And I started looking for alternative therapies along the way. And I came across this guy who I knew from the local coffee shop. Actually, they were very smoky back then, I remember. And anyway, he had chronic fatigue syndrome. And he said, hey, look, I had this spiritual meditation discipline thing that I tried, and it actually really helped me. You might want to try it yourself, right? So he gave me this grainy DVD, and I learned on my computer, this was a Falun Gong meditation, okay? What I didn't know that as this was being introduced to me, the Chinese Communist Party had started persecuting Falun Gong practitioners in China. It was almost at exactly the same time. I kind of get Guillain-Barré. This is simultaneous things happening. I didn't really know anything about it, right? I found out later. But because I was just simply watching this video, trying to mimic these movements, and it made me feel a little better. And I just did this. And within about 2 months, I go back to see my neurologist, and she tells me, you're in complete remission. Congratulations. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. Amazing. Now, the funny part for people who are in the sort of health freedom space and so forth is that my wife pointed this out to me after, of course, I told this story a few times, right? And she never asked me what I did. She never asked me what I was doing. She just said, keep doing it. That's good for you, right? But she was incurious. And I was like, I didn't even notice until Cindy, basically says, so did she ever ask you why? And actually, no, this is apparently common in these situations when people have so-called spontaneous remission. That just means you healed yourself some way that isn't in the menu that the doctor has, right? And but there isn't this, oh my God, maybe I should share this with others who have this, right? Or something, right? It's just sort of like, okay, let's move on. and back to the regular, grind. It's a very strange phenomenon. Okay, no, let me continue with the story.
Just to be clear, when, at this time, Falun Gong was. We're not talking about half a dozen people in China, or whatever. This is a huge movement, right? I mean, and
the government really estimate. So Falun Gong is very unusual. It's a very bottom up, very grassroots in a way that's even difficult for a lot of us in the West to understand. Okay, yeah. There's a lot of teachings written by a man named Li Hongzhi, very detailed in some ways, but it's very self-directed. So there's no membership. What makes you a Falun Gong practitioner is living truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance. Okay, there's no you can't enrich yourself from it. That would be something that's forbidden. There's very few rules. That would be a rule. Okay, you're not supposed to change the teachings. There's no hierarchy in it, i.e., there's no boss to tell you what you're supposed to do. You have to figure out the teachings and live them. There's even this. I find this quite amazing because, if you were a great Falun Gong practitioner, I want to emulate your ability to enact truthfulness, compassion, tolerance. Okay, I can't actually do that, as I understand it. I have to find my own way to do this. Right. And also by the way, a tell if you're talking to someone who practices Falun Gong is if they say, well, my understanding of the teachings is, because that's another kind of rule. You don't want to misrepresent your take on the teachings as the teachings, right? Because you want people to have their own experience of them, so to speak, right? So it's when you add all this up, right? And there's no, you're not joining anything. There's no worship of Li Hongzhi. It's a very interesting system. And just this, we could talk about this later, but it just kind of struck me years later, right? This didn't dawn on me until I was deep in the human rights space, already a journalist, all of this, that if you were to design a system that would somehow be able to resist totalitarianism, a totalitarian rule, it might look something like this. Because, in the crazy communist totalitarian mind, everything is I call it obscenely hierarchical. It all comes from the top and everything has to fit into it, right? But here, there's nothing to fit into. Right? It just kind of exists. It's spread by word of mouth, right? Li Hongzhi only taught for 2 years, 92 to 94 in this kind of lecture format. And afterwards he said, look, this is me paraphrasing, of course, but he said, look, if you like this, if you think it's good, if you find it valuable, share it with others, right? But never enrich yourself from it and all these basic things, right? And by the end of the 90s, 70 to 100 million people by government estimate, because Falun Gong practitioners were not estimating, they're just doing their thing, right? It was bigger than the Communist Party by this government census, so to speak, right? Which was about 60 million
American
at the time.
That would be like a third of the public, essentially.
Well, it was 1 in 13 Chinese, and assuming that the population numbers in China were real, which we're not even sure of, but let's say it's still a lot, still quite a huge population, right, of people. And the other part that's really interesting is it's also you people don't drink, you don't put sort of bad things in your bodies. Don't drink, don't smoke, generally live a healthy lifestyle. It's a very curious thing for me personally, right, is as I experienced this, and by the way, I should add this. I was just at Hillsdale College giving a talk there, and it just reminds something, they have Larry Arnn had said in this, I had happened to be at an event a week earlier where he was getting an award. Scott Atlas's Religious Liberty Institute was giving him an award. And he said something which I found so deeply profound. And I never know, because I didn't study philosophy, that if this is something everyone already knows or everyone's just finding it as profound as I do. It's usually a mix. But he said, the purpose of philosophy, the purpose of studying philosophy is to learn how to be good. Right? And I was like, oh, I was like, whoa, I was just, that's incredible. Of course, that's obviously true, right? But I never thought of it. No one certainly taught me that. And I checked with a few other people, including his assistant, right, who was taking me around the school. I was getting tours and all this. And he was like, no, I was just like you. I was like, whoa, And Larry apparently is very, very good at coming up with these things. But that reminded me that another translation of the Falun Gong core principles, truthfulness, compassion, forbearance, is actually like this. And I hadn't thought of it in years, okay? It's to be true, good, and endure. to be true. I mean, and I'm getting shivers thinking about it, because this translation, right, has a profound implication for, like, again, what we've experienced in the last 5 years of why Falun Gong practitioners, as we speak, are probably the largest civil disobedience movement in the world, peacefully telling their fellow man, communism is bad. It's not us that don't believe the propaganda that's been pushed out around us. Actually, it's the communism that's the problem. And you know it, because this system has destroyed part of your family, and that's in your family history, and you know that. And actually, you should quit the party and related organizations. There's this whole movement in China to kind of help people free their minds from this, let's call it specter of communism, this weird ideology that demands total obedience, either true obedience from your heart or performative obedience, which in some ways is better, because you're forced to lie, right? And if you don't make that lie, then, you're going to suffer for it in some way. And you know that. And the system makes sure you know that by creating these black classes, which, Falun Gong is a recent one, but there's been plenty throughout the years, starting with, let's say, the landowners, right? You want to take people's land? Well, the landowners are the bad people that you have to struggle against and destroy. And, many, many different groups, students, pro-democracy students in 89, Falun Gong in 99, Uyghur Muslims, in the Northwest. Again, I'm kind of taking this into in a bit of a different direction here, Jeffrey, but I think it's incredibly relevant. What happened was I made a promise.
That it's a dehumanization of an entire class of people based on some trait, with some belief set, maybe some profession, maybe some race or ethnicity, but it's calling a whole class of people, just subhuman, or at least not worthy of human rights.
And that has multiple purposes, right? Because on the one hand, it destroys the group that it's convenient to destroy for whatever reason, right? But the other part is it tells the population what's going to happen to you if you get on the wrong side of the party. And that's incredibly important. It's a very powerful mechanism of control. So, I didn't really think about any of this. My parents had come from communist Poland. I learned communism was bad. Okay. They had to escape actually around 1970. But I didn't get it. I grew up in an incredibly free society, right? 80s, I was just thinking about, E.T. I love that film, right? E.T. Extraterrestrial. Remember the kids like riding around, doing their thing. The parents like rarely come into the picture, right? That was actually, people don't think that this is how people live. This is how we were as kids.
Jan,
that
was
literally
my life.
Just did.
That was my life.
We just did whatever we wanted on our bikes, and it's parents. What parents? I didn't know. Yeah. Anyway, I tried to stay as far away from them as I could, right? But anyway, no. So I didn't get it. Why is it bad, right? But there was this woman who was a postdoc at the University of Alberta. I went to the local Falun Gong group and was trying to understand what it was that I was actually doing that had helped me so much, right? And this woman who was, I think, the mother of this woman who was a chemical engineer at the university, she was telling me she had escaped and she had been tortured, and you could see it, right? And the reason she had been tortured, she said, well, they gave me this piece of paper, 3 statements that I had to sign. And what you had to sign was, I renounce Falun Gong. That was one of them. Another one was, I pledge allegiance to the party, something in this vein. Okay. And the third one is, I'm going to help re-educate other people that do Falun Gong. Right, to transform them. They have this. So in communist societies, there's a very well honed over decades system of breaking people. Okay, there's an amazing. I don't know how many people have seen this in Netflix. There's this a series called The 3 Body Problem. It's this weird sci-fi series. Okay, but the incredible thing about this series is at the beginning they show a really true to life picture of what the Cultural Revolution looked like. And this was kind of, again, sort of the epitome of this type of re-education struggle system. Okay. So you have a scientist. I recommend people go out and watch it if you have Netflix. It's really, it was profound. I can't believe they actually included this. Okay. But basically what happens is, this guy's a scientist. He refuses to submit. He refuses to say black is white. He refuses to compromise his principles as a scientist. He's a truth teller, right? and he gets killed in the process of being hazed and struggled against and destroyed, his reputation destroyed. His daughter is watching, okay? And then what happens is through this, she becomes basically a nihilist and invites the aliens to come and kill everyone. I mean, roughly, okay, this is a sci-fi thing, but the incredible thing is it shows it, right? We have such a hard time understanding how this works. So this, Falun Gong practitioners become subject to this method, okay? This woman's telling me this, right? And when you hear about someone being tortured, you think to yourself, what did they do wrong? Right? Like it's just, that's how our mind works. Right. And as I was doing this bolt shot through me. Okay. And I was like, oh my God, this is communism. This woman has done nothing wrong. This woman is actually like a hero, and she's basically standing up for her core rights. Let's call them First Amendment rights. There's a reason the First Amendment's the First Amendment. It's the first protection from government, right? It's your freedom of conscience, freedom to speak, freedom to assemble, freedom to practice the faith that you want. Okay. Like that's what she was doing. She was doing the core thing that makes us human, I think. Right. And this regime wanted to kill her or torture her or break her from that. Right. And this is communism. And I realized I had, when you're ill, I've learned this is a common thing that happens. Okay. I was basically an agnostic, you could say, okay, back in the day. And I had this, I started doing this, I think they called it dealing, or I can't remember right now, but basically it's common even for people who are not religious to be like, well, God, just in case you're up there and, you're kind of facing your mortality and you're thinking to yourself, well, I said, I promised I would give my life to service. I promised I would give my life to service if things worked out, just in the odd case that you're there. Okay. And then this all happened. And this moment when this woman, I had this like amazing catharsis, and I realized it's communism, and what I have to do, my service to the world is going to be helping these people, but also helping explain what this horrible system is. Because I didn't get it. It's very hard to get if you live in a free society. I think, we've sort of experienced a bit of the totalitarian impulse in the West in the last decade, right? So I think a lot more people have a sense of what this could look like, right? It's still a far cry from what we have in a place like communist China, where, this forced organ harvesting industry, which I hope you'll give me a chance to explain what makes it unique and kind of next level organ trafficking is a feature, not a bug.
Yeah. No, let's talk about the book opens up with I think it's an American, right, looking for an organ transplant, not having waiting, not being able to find one. The markets here are very seriously throttled, and there's a shortage, and then finally deciding, well, maybe we need to pursue the China option, right? And I guess in this world, this is a well-known thing. And once you get on the plane, and it seems like, well, this is just medical tourism, a very short wait, suddenly you've got a perfect match. You come back, and you just don't want to know. You don't know what happened in the meantime.
It's a crazy reality in an ethical transplant scenario, right? The U.S. last year did a record 40,000 transplants. It's rare to be able to find the right person because our bodies reject foreign things. It's just part of how our systems work, right? So including organs. So what you try to do, well, first of all, you have to have a catastrophic accident, someone who has had a catastrophic accident, typically a car accident or a motorcycle accident. And then an ethics team has to decide this person's definitely not coming back. They can't be completely dead, no circulation, because the organs degrade really quickly and get rejected, and they're not useful very fast. So you need an almost dead person, okay, who the ethics team decides is really not coming back because you don't want to make a mistake, right? You don't want to take organs from someone that has a chance to come back, right?
Right.
And then, so now you make that decision, and they have to match blood type, tissue type, and kind of size. Okay, organ, the sort of rough construction of the organ. There's a whole bunch of elements that have to come into play. So when you add these all up, it's rare, and it takes months or years to actually find the right match. Sometimes you get lucky, right? But very often you have to wait, right? As I say in the book, for kidney transplants, about half the people on dialysis within 5 years are gone. That's the reality, right? And they're trying to, of course, help fix this, right? But the point is, your life expectancy is not good, right? So you want to get that transplant quickly, and sometimes you have to wait a very long time. Enter communist China, okay? And Yaakov Levy, one of the whistleblowers, he's the Israeli transplant surgeon, professor of transplant surgery at Tel Aviv University. He has a patient that tells him in 2005, I'm tired of waiting. He has, bad case of his heart is about to fail. I'm tired of waiting. I've got it set up in China in 2 weeks, scheduled. Okay. And now this single fact tells us a whole lot of things, just that this is possible, this one instance. Okay. One, it tells us, well, okay, you're scheduling a heart transplant, like the donor doesn't survive a heart transplant. In other words, when someone's going to be dead 2 weeks down the line on that date. How could you know that? Well, it's because you're making them dead. Huge red flag. Something horrible is happening. Okay. But the second part is the wait time. How can you get 2 weeks when normally you have to wait months or years, right? Well, so this is what happened. Okay. When this Falun Gong persecution begins, Jiang Zemin, the dictator, basically takes it on himself to eradicate, to use his term, Falun Gong practitioners. And it turns out, because of these interesting features, I think, of Falun Gong, that these people don't basically allow themselves to be re-educated or transformed easily. In fact, they're very self-directed in what they're doing. There's no puppeteer kind of telling them what to do. No, they're living this for a reason, because it works, because it's important to them. So they're not saying, yes, party. Maybe some of them are, but it's very hard to re-educate them. They incarcerate, they dehumanize them in a massive way. They push this massive propaganda into the system to justify, like 1 in 13 Chinese, you have to start believing that your neighbor, who for a while, now has been like particularly honest, kind of living very healthy lifestyle, kind of something I've even seen people win awards for like reducing healthcare costs in the region, like this as Falun Gong broadly. I mean, just fascinating stuff was happening. But now you have to believe that this person is somehow evil, right? And against society. So they push this mass propaganda through the system. And then as people were not re-educating easily, a rule became, they would incarcerate them, and the rule became all Falun Gong deaths will be considered suicides, meaning you can work on these people however hard to break them, okay? Or if they die, well, tough luck, right? That happens. And then, so they incarcerated a massive number of people, maybe 1 million, maybe 2, it was something like a half of all Falun Gong practitioners in the massive incarceration system of communist China. All these different institutions that do this were Falun Gong practitioners, per the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture back in 2005, Manfred Novak. I remember him. I was there that year in Geneva, okay? And they start blood typing them, they tissue type them, they organ scan them. And now they create a database, right? So this is how you can get the 2 weeks, because the moment that transaction is made, the moment the money is paid, okay, you already have a pre-matched prisoner of conscience ready to be killed to order, and they are, and that's how you got your scheduled heart in 2 weeks. And this is this monstrous system of death, frankly, that they created. Okay, between the year 2000, they start persecuting Falun Gong. There's a low level of organ transplantation that's happening. We even have a surgeon who's admitted to killing someone by extracting their organs prior to this scaling of the system on the backs of the Falun Gong. But once they have this massive incarcerated, dehumanized population, okay, they start growing it. And so within 5 years, by 2005, you have well over 100 transplant hospitals humming. okay, working. And that's just not surgeons, right? That's the whole transplant teams, everything. And I think it's by about 2010, we end up with about 146 hospitals, which is the number that Ethan Gutmann, one of the heroes of this whole movement, actually has his own new book out called The Xinjiang Procedure, auspiciously coming out at the same time. That's more of an academic book than mine, but incredibly important about how this is being done to Uyghurs now. He defended in front of Congress, I think it was in 2016, the number that he kind of figured out is the likely number of transplants per year that are happening, okay, based on the best available data. 60 to 100,000 transplants per year is the number that he defended. And I think it's very compelling. I tend to say, we kind of argue about this a little bit, I'd say it's 60 to 90,000, and that's what I use in the book. The reason is that I felt like 100,000 sounds like too big for people to fathom. I kept struggling with this reality, right? The whole 60 to 90 or 60 to 100,000, that whole boundary, right? It's very wide because the data is difficult to get, right? But that's a very conservative estimate in itself, extremely conservative estimate. So the reality, I wouldn't say this to people because it sounds so completely unbelievable. What? How did I not know about this? That's a crazy amount of transplants, right? Maybe 60 to 90,000, right? But I mean, it's an atrocity by any stretch of the imagination. And it's happening. It's been happening for years. They started with the Falun Gong in 2014 or 2015 when nobody really did much about it or tried to challenge it in a meaningful way at a scale. You know, of course, there were these heroes in the movement. There was even a few books that were written, very good books. Like Ethan Gutmann wrote a book called The Slaughter, which I recommend reading. It's a bit outdated now, but it's profound. But just people were not ready for this, right? So they added the Uyghur people around 2015, 2016. They dehumanized them. They incarcerated them. Next group, right? And just, this is one of the things I commented on at the Trump Kennedy Center the other night. I've been talking with a pastor named Bob Fu. He was actually in the audience. He told me he appreciated the shout out. I didn't know he was there. All I saw was bright lights up there, right? But he has been running a ministry called China Aid, which supports persecuted Christians in China, another group that's recently experiencing a lot more persecution even than they have had, which was already considerable. And I'm seeing increased dehumanizing language against Christians. I saw it like anecdotally, okay, not as I didn't do a study on this or something like this, but he said, no, absolutely, this is the case, right? So my concern is my concern, I mean, it's genuine worry, right, is that when you see this dehumanizing language, you read about genocide studies and so forth. The dehumanizing language is a central feature of any crime against humanity. It's required because human beings don't do mass murder generally. The psychopaths can do it, but normal people can't, unless they get tricked into somehow believing that this person is less than them or dangerous or somehow a problem to society, a menace, right, as part of a group. And that's how this mass propaganda is an important part of always, if you're gonna do something like an atrocity, like this forced organ harvesting from prisoners of conscience, or just simple mass murder or something, right? You have to have that dehumanization part. And I can't say what's going to happen, but I can say it really worries me that I'm seeing that now happening against another large group in China, Christians.
What do the economics of the situation look like from to your knowledge? Like, how profitable is this industry?
Well, if you take there's been a range of, we don't have a ton of information about the prices, but they range somewhere between $30,000 to $300,000. Like, just over time, it's changed. 30,000 is kind of the low end for kidneys, 300,000 high end for certain liver transplants off the top of my head, heart transplants, 150 to 200,000 over the years. But if you kind of average it out, David Matus, I believe, he came up with this number. He said it's about a $9 billion annual industry. So there's a, considerable financial motivation here, obviously, right? But here's the crazy part. Like, this is something that had not occurred to me until basically do you remember there was a hot mic moment? Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, Kim Jong-un or watching a military parade.
6 or 8 months ago, something like that.
Yeah, I think it was September.
Yeah.
Anyway, I remember my phone started buzzing basically nonstop because people know I'm interested in organ harvesting and so forth, right? Or at least stopping forced organ harvesting. And this was mentioned. So that, like, to paraphrase the conversation, okay, she says to Putin, and this is just caught on a light hot mic, and there's debate about whether it was really hot mic. That's a different topic. But she says to Putin, and I'm paraphrasing, when we're 70, we're just babies. When we're 70, we're just babies. And Putin says to Xi, well, perhaps through continual organ transplantation, we can achieve immortality, right? And then Xi responds, yeah, our target is 150 years. And so this light bulb goes off in my head, right? Because I knew for a long time that the Chinese super elites have an elite longevity project. It's called Project 981. They like naming things after numbers over there, okay? And by some accounts, and I do not know if this is a real number for sure, but by some accounts, 10 years longer super elites live than the average Chinese, right? And you could think of different ways that might happen, right? Now, remember, just keep in mind also that there's this kill to order industry, right? Like that explains the level of moral clarity or lack of moral clarity that exists. So you can kind of, anything goes to achieve that, right? Especially, these people do not believe they're going to meet their maker and be judged. They're trying to maintain power forever, right? It had never occurred to me somehow, because I knew about both, of course, the organ harvesting and this, but it never occurred to me that the forced organ harvesting was a central piece of the elite longevity project until this moment, until basically Vladimir Putin generously explained it to me.
Of course.
And no, and it's astonishing, but like, what is it worth? If let's say it's a $9 billion annual industry, let's say that's the real number, right? It's something like that. What is it worth if you're a Chinese super elite and you essentially have unlimited organs available to you on demand?
Yeah, and you don't talk about human rights, and you have no guarantees of, you don't have a philosophy of universal human dignity. You have no constitutional guarantees of any kind of rights to life or free speech or anything like that. We more or less try to take for granted in the West. Like, why wouldn't you do this? It just makes perfect sense. I mean,
but what would it be worth? And I was talking about this with someone recently on a show, and they said, well, that would be worth everything.
Yeah.
It would be worth everything, right? Yeah. And it's like, it makes me ill to think about that, because that's true. If you believe that it all ends here and there's no moral boundary, right? There's no accountability of any sort. Why wouldn't you have any number of people killed for organs for yourself?
Yeah.
And there's even anecdotes that express this.
And I think I got this from your talk the other night. It really put me to thinking a lot. It's not just about the organ harvesting. It's about a whole philosophical outlook on the purpose of human life itself, and the need for elites to sort of take control of the human person as an organism and manage it in a way that's consistent with their vision of science, and use human life for its own purposes. I wrote a book some years ago that tracked the development of the eugenics industry in English writings, basically. And it was remarkable to me that starting about the 1880s and 1890s, there's this proposition out there that was made that every farmer, every rancher curates the animal populations. I mean, they're bred for certain purposes, and part of the expertise that comes with animal husbandry or whatever is the ability to know how to control the breeding. And the proposition was, why aren't we doing this with people? Why don't we develop mastery over the human population the same way we have over cows and chickens and pigs and horses for horse racing and everything else? Why not? And what was strange about that literature as I was reading it is that there were not too many people who stood up and said, well, the reason why not is that would be unethical and wrong, right? It was rare to find anybody to say that. And there were a few, but not that many. And this eugenics idea really just kind of got unleashed in the world of academia and elite scientific circles, and caught on and grew between the 1885 or something like that, and all the way up to World War II, the Holocaust and the Nazi regime, was a shock to that sensibility in a way, because it showed where this could end up. But I'm not sure that essential philosophy has been sufficiently challenged in all these years.
It's incredible how many. I'm thinking back to your really wonderful introduction to this interview today, and how all of these things that we thought about a lot in theory over the last however many years have become real. Like, we have to face the fruits of that thought, like utilitarian bioethics. This is a wonderful man named Wesley Smith, works with the Discovery Institute, their Center for Human Exceptionalism. Has been tracking the rise of, in the West, utilitarian bioethics type thinking, which is this greater good for the greatest number thinking. And, he wrote this amazing book called Culture of Death back in 2000, updated it in 2016, because a lot of so-called progress had happened, with respect to this vision. He was looking at it in their journals, right? Ethics journals, bioethics journals, and so forth. Because he had it in his mind that this is going to spill out into reality. It's just like they're conceiving it all. They're all validating each other. This is the problem with these kind of institutions, that they're self-referential. There's no accountability. People say, "What a great idea!" But then when it actually gets applied, you're kind of insulated from the consequences of the horrible idea and the second order effects and so forth. Or you kind of you're celebrated for the idea, but you're not condemned for the horrible results of your idea, right? Unfortunately, a common feature. And then we had this, engagement, right? Like, we had this huge philosophy. When I started trying to advocate for, I knew, as I mentioned earlier, that there's a reason the First Amendment is the First Amendment in the Bill of Rights. This is these are all things that have just come to me in recent years, by the way. I was not thinking about all this stuff for most of my life, right? There's a reason. This is the most important protection from government that you can have, right? And if a regime is like killing people for exercising these basic core human rights, they cannot be liberalizing. Right. But we were supposed to believe. And indeed, in the early, 2000s, when I just became conscious of this whole reality, right, it was a 95-5 issue. Everybody, left, right, Republican, Democrat, up, down, whatever, we're all believing this Kissinger doctrine that China was liberalizing, and by pumping enough cash into their system, we were going to change them into a South Korea or a Taiwan or something like that. It was incredibly lonely, Jeffrey.
Yeah, I get it. And right? Look, I believed it, right? I'm a product of that generation, right? If you just free the markets, free the prices, let everybody start a business, and turn everybody into like a mass consumer society, then human rights just naturally follow, and so does democracy, and everybody becomes like, the founding fathers or whatever. I mean, we all believe that, right? And something happened. It didn't happen. Look, this is such a profound point about, you can have an ostensibly commercial society that's still violating human rights on a mass scale. I mean, this is something that had never occurred to me, but in many ways we see it in action right now.
Yeah.
I want to say this to Jan too, because I think one of the dangers of this it's not dangerous. But one of the things about this book and about this topic is I think it might be too easy for people to go, well, CCP is bad. What do we care about that? I mean, that's some bad stuff going down over there. Thank goodness it's not going on here. But there's many ways in which there's a kind of foreshadowing that takes place within CCP management of the social order in China that pertains to here, the social credit systems, surveillance capitalism, the digitization of everything in service of the regime, the capacity of the regime to just turn you off, shut down your life if you're non-compliant. I mean, there are ways in which we're seeing similar trends here, and I just don't want to draw attention to the crucial thing that I think about a lot, which is the COVID experience. You know, it didn't just happen to 194 countries out of nowhere. It was the lockdowns were first practiced in China. The World Health Organization sent a junket out there filled with Anthony Fauci's assistant and all these people from Europe and the UK, visited Wuhan and so on. And the party escorted them around and said, look how we crushed the virus. We locked everybody in their homes. We banned travel. We arrested anybody who got the disease. It was tough. It was tough. We were hard on people. It was pretty scary there for a while. But now look, we've mastered the microbial kingdom. Thanks to the party power and our science, we have mastered the microbial kingdom. Now, you'd think if you had a brain, you'd walk away from that going, well, that's the dumbest, poorest excuse for a Potemkin village I've ever seen in my life, right? What's wrong with you people? That what an idiot. No, that's not what happened. What happened is the World Health Organization put out a report saying, wow, you never would have thought it, but for some reason, these geniuses, I mean, these words they were using, these geniuses of the party, they really understand microbiology and understand public health. And they issued these edicts, and it was a beautiful thing to say. All the Chinese people just rallied and complied, and now look, they've eradicated the virus. This is a report that came out from the World Health Organization. I'm going to say it was like February 26th, 2020. And like that was the turning point. Right? And so 194 nations just out of nowhere copied the CCP's approach based on the so-called evidence of this one junket. That's the actual history that went on there. So that, in other words, that's why this really matters. There's a spooky way in which the CCP's management of the social order is being valorized in elite circles all over the world today. You agree with that?
100%. And this is the thing, right? So when you have engagement, which we've had a lot of, right? This has been the mantra, engagement with communist China. Of course, in our mentality, right? I have a whole chapter in the book that explains how the Chinese Communist Party makes others complicit in its mentality, in what it does, in how it gets power and wealth, both its own people and also the barbarians, as we are known, to be bamboozled, okay? And this was actually the plan. Jiang Zemin, the guy that started the Falun Gong persecution against, by the way, advice from most of his leadership, curiously, right? That was his job. He was the expert bamboozler of barbarians, so to speak, right? He had this close relationship with, and I don't want to pick specifically on Dianne Feinstein, she's passed away now, but that was one of those tight relationships before he came to power that helped facilitate the engagement. He did this with many people. That's just one that's come to light recently through Lee Smith's amazing work. And, there was a kind of a spy in her entourage for 24 years or something like this that was kind of feeding them. My point is simply that this engagement that was created, and they would say things like, after, say, Tiananmen Square, the Chinese military massacres students looking for democracy and freedom in Tiananmen Square, right? But what happens is the U.S. administration sends Scowcroft, top-level National Security Council official, to China later. We discover this later, basically saying, look, we're going to ride this out. Don't worry. Now, how does that happen? How does that happen? Well, it happens like this. The Chinese leadership, probably Jiang himself, was saying, look, we're reformers here. Look, we started, we have this great financial relationship. You guys are changing us for the better, right? We are liberalizing, but there's these hardliners, that in Tiananmen Square, the hardliners won. They won, and that's true. But if you really cramp down on us, the hardliners are just going to take control. And we still have power, us reformers. We're going to change things. Let's work together, but don't make too much of a fuss, right? I can just see, like, this is the standard mantra. It worked every time, right? Why did it work? Well, partially gullibility, I think, right? But partially because of the financial relationship. They were leveraging greed. Mark Twain has this amazing comment, which I always forget. I could promise myself I'm going to remember, where he basically, I would love to get this into my head properly, but basically, if you're financially motivated to not notice something, it's very hard to notice it.
That's
okay?
right. Yeah.
So,
well, it's a fascinating reconstruction of a period of time and a range of expectations that didn't turn out to be true. We saw this collapse of communism and Russia and Eastern Europe, and everybody here was saying, well, this is just great, because once you get rid of socialism and you have a commercial economy, then you have democracy naturally follows, then human rights naturally follow, and then Thomas Jefferson will rule the world, and that was the end of history as it was constructed for us, right? But after Tiananmen Square. That did not take the same trajectory as the protests in Eastern Europe and Russia and so on, right? It went a completely different direction. And
it was even, Jeffrey, if I may jump in, right?
Yeah.
It was the same. So the first Polish post-communist elections were held the day of the Tiananmen Square massacre, same day. Two different directions. And some years went by where there was still, that was then, this was an act of desperation. This is the last great hurrah of the regime. It's still going down. But it didn't go down. And as you say, the economic, which is another whole part of this. I mean, it's worthy of a different interview and study. How this came to be, how China became the manufacturer to the world, and the rest of the world just gave up, said, well, we can't make anything, just sell us stuff and we'll be happy, right? But the crucial thing of people's government, right? This is what we mean by when we say democracy. We really mean, the people should be in charge of the government, not the reverse. Something like that, an old Enlightenment idea, perfected in America, really. And then with that, this idea of inherent human rights, as described in the Declaration of Independence, as the foundation for an authentic freedom. So those pieces never came into place. We drove a wall between a successful commercial economy on one hand and human rights and freedom and human dignity on the other. That was our downfall. I mean, because it's so obvious, right? How can you trade if someone violates the most basic rights? Again, let's go back to, right, like this freedom of conscience, I would argue, is the most basic right. My decision, my ability I'm allowed to believe what I want to, right? Like no one has the right to impose that on me, right? Like it's just so fundamental, right? Yeah. But we know, right, over on the other end, that's not happening. So and we're just getting in bed casually, having all these relationships, treating people that are involved in this core, most basic of violations as if they're our favorite uncle, as if they're just our buddy, and we're actually on the same wavelength. We're just working. How can that not change us, right? In our imagination, we were changing them, right? But this is what the effect of engagement. There is someone is changing someone for sure when there's engagement, right? It just happened in the other direction. And this is what we have to fight now, because otherwise we're going to end up like that, right? This is if we want to talk about, right? Like sometimes people in the health freedom movement and the human rights in America movement, there were significant civil rights violations, of course, right? During COVID and so forth. Yes. But they say, well, we're just like China. It's like, no, actually.
Not yet.
No, we are not we're not remotely like China, but that's a lesson. If you want to see what happened here, that's where we're going to go unless we decide to exercise our we the people rights and make sure that doesn't happen, right?
Well, you know what I did this weekend? It was this weekend. I took out the Declaration of Independence and just read it. And I wrote a commentary for Epoch Times, like sentence by sentence, just how it begins, how it's constructed. The philosophical phrasing of the opening sentence about, among these, right, made in the image of God, with granted inherent rights, among them right, liberty, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. And then the follow-up sentence saying, you don't want to change governments for light and transient reasons. There has to be a good reason to do this. And then they list all the reasons. And then it ends. It's a fascinating thing, because the question is, well, you're making a declaration of independence. Who do you think is going to grant this? What is the authority to whom you're appealing, right? You don't know until you get to the very end. And the appeal is to the supreme judge of the world, right? It's to heaven, right? They're making an appeal to heaven. They are, so there you have the perfect bracket. You began with the claims about the maker and the kind of rights that human beings were created to have inherently. And then you end, bookend it on the other side with an appeal essentially to God, So I think in some ways, I didn't mean to go on a disquisition on the Declaration, but this is the 250th anniversary of that great document. And in so many ways, there are many other things to read, including your book, but I hope everybody goes back to that document and rereads it. I'm not here to sort of push other books, but Matt Spalding over at Hillsdale has written an incredible book about this exact topic. I learned so many things. I had him on the show, American Thought Leaders, recently about it. And actually, I got for Christmas, my family already knows kind of what I'm into, but I got Walter Isaacson's versions, like a very small book about how to read the Declaration. So I'm being fed this right now. It's the most astonishing document, right? And it's like, I don't want to be like, am I an America fanboy? Yeah. Yeah.
I'm an America fanboy.
That's the beating heart of America. And everything should be measured against it, I think, anyway.
And I mean, we veered from there, right? And this is, in a way, it's on, are we on a knife's edge? Maybe we are. Like a lot of people would say that things could really go in a very different direction. Yeah. Or we could say, yes, these are our fundamental, this is our approach to governance. This is what we are going to do, but we're going to have to work our butts off for it, because there's a lot of interest, and this is, I would say, and not just even, it's not a left-right thing. I think there's a weird totalitarian impulse in the air, and we just can't allow that.
One of the forwards to your book was written by Joseph Farron, who's the president of the Independent Medical Alliance. And the last time I met with him, about a week earlier, there was an article in the New York Times called "We Need a New Definition of Death." Yes. I think is the name of the article, and it was a squirrely piece about, some people aren't dead, but they kind of more or less are. So why not just treat them as dead? And Verone was going crazy, and he pointed to this article and said, "Look, this is where we're headed." if you start playing with what's the difference between being alive and being dead, and when can a body be harvested for parts, you're undermining the very foundation of human rights itself. So I'm glad to see that he wrote the foreword to your book. The book, what do you think the philosophical implications of your book are? Do you wonder if people will finish your book and go, will ask that fundamental question, what really is wrong with this system? Right? So that's the question that you're asking, right? And that's what you're wanting people to answer. In a philosophical sense.
Apparently, right, as I mentioned again, sort of at the beginning, after you made this amazing introduction, I truly think that the book is a meditation on utilitarianism versus the dignity of the individual human being. It's a central theme in the book, actually, right? I thought about it as the sort of the juxtaposition between Hippocratic medicine and utilitarian bioethics, right? With Hippocratic medicine being the predating even the Judeo-Christian tradition or the Christian tradition, the idea that do no harm when you put an intervention, treat every person as a whole, do your best for that person, that this inherent dignity of the human being. On the other side, the greatest good for the greatest number. It's okay to sacrifice a few for the good of the whole, and why that always leads to hell, and how communism is really the sort of perfect expression of that mentality every time, right?
With many other implications and many other areas of life. Like we have to get
100%.
We have to get this right. We have to get this right, or you're right. The end result is straight to hell. Maybe not immediately, but eventually. Jan, I've kept you way longer than I should have. It's so easy to talk to you and so fun. I hope everybody goes out and buys your book and sustains its #1 status now under communism. Is that the #1?
It's remarkable, but like right as we speak, it's the #4 book in like politics on Amazon, which is kind of wild. But communism and socialism, Asian politics, there's a bunch of, I think, genocide and something. It was neat because I'm in a category there with one of Victor Davis Hanson's book. He's one of my favorite authors. So
I'm just imagining these kind of readers. It's like, I want to read something really, really dark today. What should I buy?
Well, no, it's a light read of something very, very dark. No, but in all seriousness, we're trying to create a kind of movement. Like there's actually new legislation that was just introduced by Senator Cruz, and it's a bill that's been made its way through the House a few times unanimously. Okay, yeah. They updated the name. It's the Falun Gong and Victims of Forced Organ Harvesting Protection Act. Passed the House, literally zero dissent in getting this bill through. Right, even the people that really don't like voting for any foreign policy intervention agreed that this is a good idea.
That's right.
Now it's in the Senate. And now it's been reintroduced as bipartisan, Cruz, Merkley, and it's kind of a no-brainer. And I think if it's one of these things, if it gets to the floor, these things typically die on the floor. I think the CCP goes to great lengths through its influence to prevent that from happening. Because I think if it gets to the floor, it's hard for anyone to vote against something that just says basically like, let's establish for sure that this organ harvesting is happening, like that the reporting. Let's sanction people that are involved in it. This is like a very good use of the sanction power, by the way, I think. Even
if it's just to say this is wrong, right? I mean, that by itself is
100%, 100%, right?
Yeah. What's it like for you, Jan? You've been working on this for a major part of your career in journalism. How do you feel with the book finally out? Do you have how does it feel?
The reason it exists, really, a big part of it is it struck me that I think somehow through the COVID years we became a bit wiser, at least some of us, okay, and we're ready to accept some of these things which for the longest time people were not. Like the hardest thing with this issue is having people listen. at all.
Yeah.
Because it's really extreme. It's a really extreme evil yet to be seen on this planet. One of the amazing researchers, David Matus, described it as that. And I think it's right. And it's really hard it's a horror that's hard for us to conceive. And we just don't want to go there. Our mind tries to escape. That happened to me when I was first really contemplating it, frankly, but I've kind of become a bit desensitized to it now.
Yeah.
But today, somehow people don't leave mentally. People are just say, this is horrible. What can I do? Right. And I've noticed this shift. And I think the COVID years, both when we saw what we can do to ourselves, right, in a free society, and also watching people being welded into their homes by a totalitarian regime in China, I think all of that kind of helped get us to think, wait a second, maybe, maybe there's other things. There is a survivor. I mean, I never in a million years thought we would see a survivor of forced organ harvesting, guy who's missing part of his liver and part of his lung, but he's somehow alive, to tell his story of being, coerced and body parts being taken from him against his will. And they even admit to having done the operation, which is itself astonishing. I'm not going to get, that's a different episode.
But your point is a profound one. There has been the COVID experience really opened up our eyes. And I tell you, yeah, there's more to say about this, but like for me personally, I think before this period, before March 2020, I had just taken for granted the end of history idea that we're on this trajectory towards, this uninterruptible Hegelian progress. Right? Thanks to the internet or, I don't know, streaming music or I don't know. It's hard for me to reconstruct what I was thinking.
Yeah. No, but all this was happening in the background, right?
Yeah.
Like we didn't want to see it. This was all progressing, moving along. And then it just sort of sprung upon us in, basically early 2020. And we saw a lot of things that, frankly, most of us couldn't understand. You understood it very early, I might add, which is I really appreciate.
Well, I warned against it. I remember writing an article in January saying, this could happen. And people, I did radio interviews and people say, this is the craziest conspiracy theory I've ever read in my life. Nothing like this would ever happen. And I would clarify, well, look, I'm not saying it's going to happen. I'm just saying that it could. There are some people who believe that it should. I don't actually believe it'll happen, but I'm just like, this is bad that we even could have imagined such a thing. So that was, and then of course it all came.
There's people in our societies. I've been thinking a lot about this, right? Like we have different personality characteristics. I'm wired for freedom, right? I know I am because when it starts being taken away, I start feeling really uncomfortable. And you are also, Jeffrey. I know we share this characteristic, but not everybody is. And some people are actually wired for control. And I think that I think that those people have a purpose in society. Actually, I think like all of us have a role to play in society. Some things do need to be controlled very well, but you don't want those people in governance positions. I think to me, that's my lesson, right? Yeah. Like I think we've gotten to a place where there's this collective view. Somehow it's become a thing, right? Where you think like, this sort of like somehow if we just have enough data, this is a technocratic view, right? So if we just have enough data, we can control it all. Weather, people's bodies, we'll just have the perfect society. It'll be a brave new world,
kingdom.
Right?
We can create eternal life, which is, by the way, it was a common view, and the pharmaceutical journals at the turn of the 20th century. I went through the archives and read them. It was amazing how many people thought that we will obtain eternal life through manipulating biology with the right pharmaceutical products and the right surgical procedures. We'll get there. They believed this. 1901, 1902, 1903. That was very common. But Jan, I've kept you long enough. Hey, your work is helping to wire more people for freedom. So that's great. I'm proud to be a friend and colleague of yours. And thank you so much for coming on Brownstone.
If I may encourage people to pick up the book, the link that killedtoorder.com, that takes you right to the Amazon link. This book can help raise some awareness, get a bill passed. I actually have a whole appendix with, if you're wondering to yourself, again, like you said, Jeffrey, this is China, this is far away. This is making us complicit We train some of those surgeons. We do all this. Basically, in an appendix, I lay out what anyone at the grassroots level, living in a community far away from Washington, D.C., or at the state level, or at the municipal level, or at the federal level, a legislator, everybody can actually do something very meaningful at this time. And I lay it all out very simply, at towards the end of the book, because I really think we can create a movement with this and put a dent in this, or at least end our own complicity in it. And we should. It's the right thing to do.
We'll have all the links in the show notes. Thank you so much, Jan.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey.